Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our next session of the On the Mark Financial Forum and podcast. I've been really excited for this session today. We've got an amazing co-host who I'll introduce momentarily. A lot of you already know him, but I'm really excited because this is a really, really hot topic. We're going to be talking about how to navigate the most recent ruling by the National Association of Realtors and how that impacts real estate in different parts of the country. We have a really wide audience of attendees today. We've got agents from different parts of the country. We've got financial advisors. We have prop tech entrepreneurs from all different markets. So we're going to try to keep this somewhat generic, but my co-host Neil will introduce himself momentarily. Many of you already know him, but if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A within Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them. We did have a bunch of people that submitted questions ahead of time, which we really appreciate, and we will do our best to get to all of the questions. I'm sure there are many, and if need be, we can set up another Q&A session if there are more questions than we can get to in today's session. So without further ado, I'd like to officially introduce Neil Garfinkel, who is a longtime friend of our team and just as good as it gets in the legal field. So Neil, maybe you can introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about what you do and how you can help people.
Sure. So thanks for having me, Mark. Again, we've got this great long-standing relationship, goes back many years, and I appreciate you having me today. So real briefly about myself, my name is Neil Garfinkel. My firm is Abrams, Garfinkel, Margolis, Bergson. We just turned 29, and I've spent a good part of my career doing two things: representing the real estate brokerage industry and representing lenders, doing closings and purchasers. So kind of that's what I'm known for. In particular, I have been counsel or broker counsel to the Real Estate Board of New York for the last 17 years. I'm the creator of the Toolbox for Real Estate Agents Success and a co-founder of a real estate school called the Real Estate Center for Success. And so I spend a lot of time working with the real estate brokerage community and the mortgage community as well.
Yeah, well, pretty much everybody who's in New York knows the one and only Neil Garfinkel. So there's nobody better to come and join us on today's session. So thank you, Neil, for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. You got a lot of different things going on, and you're helping a lot of people. So we appreciate you taking the time today. So I wanted to start, because not everyone on the call is a real estate agent who lives in this world, you know, all day, every day. I would love for you to start to just kind of explain a little bit about what the National Association of Realtors does and, you know, what their role is in the overall real estate community.
Sure. So the National Association of Realtors, or NAR, is the largest real estate trade association in the country. And the way that NAR works is it has local state affiliates. So for example, New York has the New York State Association of Realtors, and then there are effectively chapters below that. So for example, you might have the Long Island Board of Realtors as well. All of those are NAR associations. REBNY is not a NAR association. It's not affiliated with NAR. That occurred many years ago. But NAR again is kind of this umbrella, and it is the largest real estate trade association nationally. There was so what you're referring to, Mark, I think, is kind of these recent rulings about the way that members of the National Association of Realtors and MLSs, multiple listing services, are cooperating with each other. And in particular, there have been these lawsuits that claim that the way that the various members of these trade associations, the NAR affiliates, the multiple listing services, the way that they work together is anti-competitive. And particularly, there was something called the Clear Cooperation Rule, which required a seller's broker to share a commission with a buyer's broker. And that was, and that really is kind of the heart of these cases, the idea that by requiring compensation to be shared, it creates an anti-competitive landscape. There is one particular case, there's a number of cases out there right now. One was recently, it was a jury verdict, and it was the Sitzer case, and the jury actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, that in fact the way that they were working together was anti-competitive. That is being appealed. There were other participants or other defendants in that case who actually settled that case. And so there have been some parties who have settled after, and that was before the verdict. After the verdict, obviously, it is being challenged. So unfortunately, there is far more unknown than known as it relates to what's going on. And Mark, I would suggest to you that if anyone knows exactly where this is going to wind up, they're not telling you the truth, because I don't think anyone really has any idea of where this is going to wind up.
Yeah, it's definitely an evolving situation, and I think everyone is doing their best to get ahead of it, and that's why we're having today's session. That's why we've been doing a lot of work on the lending side to see how we can help, which we'll get into later. But yeah, so who was the lawsuit brought by, and why are they up in arms?
So it's a whole different conversation, quite frankly, but they were just sellers. And how they got to these plaintiff attorneys, I don't know. The plaintiff attorneys are obviously smart people who felt that there was an opportunity to bring this lawsuit. Really a conversation for another day. I prefer not to air my feelings about some of this, because how they're ultimately going to get paid and who ultimately makes a lot of the money here, it's really a conversation for another day.
Right, for sure. And again, still very much evolving, and appeals will happen. And as we all know, legal cases tend to get dragged out over long periods of time.
Yeah, this has been ongoing for quite some time. So it's
Okay. And can you explain the role of REBNY for those that don't know REBNY? REBNY is the Real Estate Board of New York. How does REBNY help mitigate this type of situation?
Well, so a couple of things REBNY is also, it's the largest real estate trade association in the city. It covers Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, parts of Brooklyn and Queens, but so it is similar, I suppose, to NAR, right? It's a real estate trade association. It has something called the RLS. It never, to my knowledge, ever had this concept of the clear cooperation rule, though. So it was different. REBNY is also a little bit different in that it has a very strong management component, developer component, commercial component. It's just a little bit different than other trade associations, and for reasons I wasn't involved. Again, I've been counsel to REBNY for 17 years. They were a member of NAR at one point. They're not anymore. So, and they haven't been for, again, my tenure at least. So similar, but a little bit different. And so REBNY had been working on making some changes to their rules for quite some time. And some of the things that they've recently changed, for example, is how now a seller is required to make if they choose to, they can make an offer of compensation directly to a buyer's agent. So what it's called decoupling the commission, instead of the seller entering into an agreement effectively where they say, well, I'm going to pay the listing broker, the selling broker, and then the selling broker will share their commission if they choose to with the buyer's broker. That's no longer the case anymore. Now what's going to happen is that if a seller would like to offer compensation to a buyer's broker, they're going to offer that directly to the buyer's broker.
Got it. And I've heard through the grapevine, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but you can dispel this if not. But is there a restriction on the listing agent even suggesting what a buyer's agent should get paid? Like, how do how can they navigate those situations?
Yes. So, and I've again been talking about this forever. Commissions are freely negotiable. There is absolutely there's no set commissions. REBNY doesn't set commissions. New York State doesn't set commissions. So there is no limitation. The seller can make a decision on what they choose to do in order to sell their property. They should take into account, well, what is the best way for me to sell my property? What is the best interest of the wrong term? What is the best way for the buyer, for me to work with a buyer, and so on? Completely negotiable. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been doing this I've been working in the industry well over the 17 years. For REBNY, so for most of my career, Mark, I've seen every model come and go. I've seen every commission. I've seen discount commissions, all these different things. Here's what I would say to the audience, right? Which is control what you can control. And what do I mean by that? There's, as we just talked about, there's so much unknown out there. But for the agent, it's really important that they not get caught up in the noise, so to speak, but they really focus on being the very best agents they can be. I teach a class called Using the Agency Disclosure Form as the Best Form of Marketing. Now, the agency disclosure form is a form that real estate agents need to give to consumers in New York, discloses how they're acting. And I've been teaching this class for most of the 17 years that I've been counsel to REBNY. And the idea is that the agent needs to really take the opportunity to talk about who they are, what they do, how they're going to do it. And so you have to give this form, but it's really important that you do take that opportunity to really describe to the consumers how you're acting in that transaction. I would suggest to you, as important as it was then, it's now even more important, because there is going to be misunderstandings about what roles people are playing. And you know, in the past, I suppose the buyer just assumed that the seller was going to be paying the commission. Well, that could change. That may change, right? And that may change over time. Okay, so be it. But I think it really starts with the agents first and foremost, really needing to understand what's going on and really explaining to the consumers the value that they bring to the transaction. There is this perception maybe that they're not worthy of their commissions and so on. They get paid too much money. Their jobs are easy. These are all misconceptions that we see all the time.
Yeah,
well,
definitely a misconception. We see it firsthand. Agents work really, really hard.
So the idea is that you need to counter those objections now more than ever. Change is not a bad thing. Change happens all the time. It's what you do with the change. It's how you handle this change. That's what's going to be relevant. And I would suggest now more than ever, again, they need to really be the very best agents they could be.
I would agree. And, you know, this just opens up a whole new discussion with buyers and makes the choice of buyer's agent so much more important, because some will probably be better at navigating this than others. But I know one concern that I've heard from agents that we've been talking to is the need for a new buyer's agent disclosure, which will basically indicate the relationship between the buyer and the buyer's broker. And some of them are a little concerned because if they, for example, just met someone for the first time and they're asking them to sign a pretty intensive disclosure, they're concerned that that may scare people off and that they won't decide to work with a buyer's broker. So can you talk a little bit about what disclosures are going to be required? I don't know if that's still in the works or if it's finalized, but
yeah, I'm not sure that disclosure is the right word. We have an agency disclosure form in New York so that's not, the question is, are you going to have a buyer's brokerage agreement?
Right.
Which, by the way, again, I created a buyer's broker agreement, 15 years ago, whatever. It's been out there. Buyers tend to want to act as free agents. They don't necessarily want to sign up with anyone. I've said for years, if you're a good buyer's broker, you can get a buyer to sign either a non-exclusive or an exclusive agreement with you. That's terrific. lot of buyers don't want to do that. So, so again, the idea of shifting mindset, being able to explain to the buyer why you'd like to have an agreement with them and how that agreement is going to work and so on, is going to be relevant. We just did for Rebney, we came out with some, as of January 1st, some suggested language, some suggested agreements, some language that, number one, can go into the exclusive agreement that the seller has with the selling broker. We came up with an agreement, and again, suggested language that a buyer's broker can enter into with the seller in order to demonstrate the compensation that's being paid. We came up with a structure, a checklist for buyer's representation agreements. So we're providing the information out there, encouraging, agents and firms to speak to their own attorneys, but we're trying to provide this framework within which, recognizing that people are going to be asking these questions, how do you move forward? What is the path forward? Particularly when I think it's going to be more a function of questions. Like, I heard about this. Well, what does that mean? And being able to explain that, I think, is going to be really important. And then having that agreement to present to them potentially is important, but it's not required any more than it was yesterday, quite frankly, or prior to these things happening.
Right. It's just probably good practice to get in the habit of doing these things, so an agent can protect themselves if they're working with a buyer and they don't have that agreement lined up, and then they go to make an offer on a property. Now all of a sudden you're in crunch time to figure that out, and kind of might put the client in an awkward situation where they're being forced to sign something that they weren't anticipating.
So again, it goes back to the training that we do. I believe in a systematic approach to the way that real estate agents should conduct their business. And they should use checklists, and they should have a non-negotiable checklist. What do I mean? Things that they do on every transaction. Well, guess what question number one is? Question number one is always, who am I representing? Right? And then question two is, did I give the agency disclosure form? Okay. If I do that, we'll skip over question two, which is, if you give the agency disclosure form, you have to give the fair housing disclosure form. Guess what question number three is? How am I getting paid? And do I have an agreement that supports that? The agents that do that on every transaction at the very beginning, they don't find themselves in the situation you just posed, Mark, where they're scrambling, because they ask ahead of time and they make sure that they have agreements ahead of time which demonstrate exactly how they're going to get paid. That should be non-negotiable in every transaction. They need to do that. Who am I representing? How am I getting paid? Two of the most important questions that they could ask.
Right. And the challenge is that for a buyer's agent, if I put myself in their shoes, is that they may be working with a buyer for weeks and weeks, if not months, before they actually find a property, without knowing in advance that that particular property will have a buyer's agent commission built in, if the seller is willing to pay that or not.
Well, so I can't speak for, because I can't really speak for the MLS environments, but in the Rebney environment, the seller is going to direct the seller's broker to indicate what compensation they're willing to pay to the buyer's broker. So you will see that there is this offer of compensation for a particular property.
And would you say it will become best practice, if it's not already in the first 11 days of this new ruling, that should go into a listing presentation, like an online listing or something like that, or in the agent comments?
No, but the listing agreement will provide now that statement that I'm authorizing you. Look, let's take a step back. A good listing agreement prior to January 1st in the Rebney environment should have said the following. Hey, if you sell my property, then this is the commission. If you sell my property and through a co-brokerage agreement, then this is what I'm willing to pay to what the buyer's broker should be paid. If you sell my property without a broker, then this is what the commission. It should have laid out all of those things to begin with. So a good listing agreement should have done that to begin with. Now we're saying, well, now just be crystal clear that what you're offering that buyer's broker, but it's really not that different than when there was the quote unquote co-brokerage. It's effectively the same thing. One other thing that Rebney talked about was the idea that the commission would be paid directly from the seller to the buyer's broker. Well, guess what? I haven't been to a closing. I couldn't tell you the last time I was at a closing where the seller wrote a check to the seller's broker, and then the seller's broker shared that with the buyer's broker. Usually,
I don't remember that either. Even on our closing statements, those are broken out.
So the point is that we've effectively been doing all of this all along. Nothing is really, things aren't changing all of that much. Now, will there be changes? Yeah, I think partially because of awareness and so on, and that's okay. Again, it's a function of who's going to really make sure that they understand what's going on, what the differences are, and how they're going to deal with that.
Right. And so going back to putting myself in the buyer's agent's shoes, if they do all this work for a client and then the client finds a property online, for example, that does not have a buyer's commission paid by the seller, then technically speaking, the buyer may have to pick up whatever they have agreed to and pay for that theoretically out of pocket, or again, we have some solutions for that we'll talk about, but
yeah,
that's the worst case scenario for a buyer.
Just because, quite frankly, just because we've kind of come up with the structure for a good buyer's broker agreement, I don't know that buyers are going to be willing to sign these agreements. They like being free agents. That's why I always talk about, forever talking about the idea that the buyer's broker really needs to establish this level of trust with the buyer so that the buyer has a loyalty to them, that they've taken them, but unfortunately that doesn't always work out that way. So now more than ever, they really should make sure that they have that relationship.
Right. Yeah. And it's gonna make that initial conversation or series of conversations even more critical for buyers to have with their buyer's agents, because the agents, they do a lot of work before you get to the point of actually going into escrow or contract on a deal, taking clients out to multiple properties, lining up tours, going and previewing properties for them. So the last thing you want to do is show up to a listing, your client likes what they have to likes what they see, and then all of a sudden the buyer's agent's getting cut out. I think that's their biggest concern that I'm hearing, at least talking to the agents that are in our inner circle that we work closely with. That's the biggest concern, and that's where the buyer's agreement comes into place if you can get an exclusive. But again, it's tough to get a new buyer that you've just started conversations with to say, well, if the seller doesn't pay me, you'll pay me X amount, X percent, whatever. Sure. That's going to be a tough sell.
Right. It definitely may be, and we're going to see how those things shake out. There's a fungibility to the pool of resources, the pool of money that's there. So if a buyer is now having to pay a commission, then presumably that they're going to reduce a purchase price, it seems to me. But that's, right. There's just this pool of money that gets whacked up. That's always been the case. If it's coming, if I'm taking more money out of my pocket one way, then I've got to figure out another way to limit that. So that's just going to be, and that's, again, conversation for another day about why I think some of these cases are really not. I don't think they're productive. I don't think they're going to wind up doing the things that they want to. And again, that's we could talk about that another time.
Right. Well, it sounds like you said, there's not really a lot changing other than just clarifying that relationship between the buyer and the buyer's agent. Everything else more or less is staying kind of status quo.
Yeah. And again, you could have a non-exclusive representation agreement with a buyer, which I think is a fabulous idea. And if you can get a buyer to sign it, that's great. Even the non-exclusive sets forth these things and so on. Yeah,
can you explain, Neil? I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Can you explain to the audience what a non-exclusive agreement would indicate?
Sure. It's basically saying, look, in an exclusive relationship, and there's different types of exclusive listings and so on, but this as a very macro level, an exclusive says, look, even if I don't sell the property and you find someone else, a buyer on your own, it varies depending on the listing. But in general, then I'm going to get paid. Okay, so with a buyer, if you have an exclusive with a buyer, basically the buyer's saying, I will only exclusively work with you. And even if I don't work with you and I buy something, you're going to get compensated for that. A non-exclusive would say, okay, if I show you properties, you're not going to work with me exclusively, but if I do show you these properties, which we should memorialize, that I'm going to look for the commission from the seller, but should the seller not pay it, then you might agree to pay it to me. So they're not tied to one particular broker. They could be a free agent if they want to. And then again, that could get structured differently and so on. It could also say, look, I'm not paying you anything. I'll work with you. If we find a property, then the seller's paying the commission. That's great. That's not a bad thing either. It just shows, again, it builds that loyalty and so on.
Yeah. And I think one of the other concerns that I've heard is that listing agents, obviously they get to the seller first, so they determine commissions before any buyer's agent is involved because the property hasn't even been listed yet. The concern is that they might try to take advantage of that circumstance and sell a seller on, well, you don't have to pay a broker's commission, just let the buyer figure it out. The downside to that from a marketing standpoint is that you're not likely to get anywhere near the exposure that you would get to your property. So it's a little bit short-sighted. If you're talking about $1 million property, let's say the buyer's agent commission is 3%, it's $30,000. If you have twice as many buyers, that property is probably going to get bid up by more than $30,000 more. So you hope that sellers won't be short-sighted with that.
I think that they're either going to recognize that or they're going to learn, and we'll see where the marketplace takes that then.
Yeah, exactly. And so, obviously there's some positives and negatives for buyers, and I don't mean to ask you to speculate, but just thinking through like what, for buyers, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, this will help them just clarify the relationship with the buyer's agent, but it could mean theoretically that they might end up paying the commission that historically they haven't been responsible to pay. And for sellers, they have to make that decision early on if they're going to want to include the agent commission on the buyer's side or not. But theoretically, even if they have a listing agreement, let's say that doesn't include a buyer's broker commission, when they actually make a deal with a buyer, that could theoretically all be renegotiated, correct?
So theoretically, yes, it's always negotiable. With respect to Rebney in the RLS, once the seller offers that commission, they can't renege on that. So if they offer it to the buyer is relying on that. I actually think, Mark, that I'm more concerned about that buyers are going to be left out in the cold. That they're, you might have a seller who is short-sighted and says, well, okay, I could save some money here. And buyers are going to be unrepresented. And I am a huge believer of the importance of buyers being represented. Like I bought in 2019, I sold my house, bought my house. I didn't need to use a buyer's broker, but I did. And let me tell you, she was terrific and really helped us get the house that we wanted. So I see the benefit. I work with agents all day long. I am a huge proponent, but it's not only because it's what I do, it's because I believe in it. And I'm concerned that the party that's going to get the shortest end here is going to be those buyers, because they're going to be squeezed, and they're going to say, well, I just won't use a buyer's broker at that point. I don't think that's going to be good.
Right. No, I agree. And that's probably the exact opposite of what NAR wants to happen. And not really the heart of the lawsuit is to hurt buyers. The point was to help buyers, but sometimes.
The point of the lawsuit is a money grab, is what.
Right. Yeah, that too. So So would a buyer's agent theoretically have a way of opting out of working with a client if they're not willing to sign any type of agreement? There's no obligation at that point for a buyer's agent to continue with that buyer. Is that correct?
Well, but I mean, the answer is buyer, yes, I mean, for the most part, yes, that would be the case, right? But that, again, the way that most buyers work with buyers brokers today is there is no agreement. I want to see a property. Can you show me a property? Yes, I'll take you to see the property. There'll have to be a clarity on or an understanding of how they're going to get paid, which is important. But if someone wants to see properties where the buyer's not willing to pay and the seller's not willing to pay, that buyer's agent is not going to work with them because buyer's agent shouldn't have to work for free.
Right. Yeah, I kind of envision it similar to the way that the mortgage industry works. People are shopping around, they're talking to lots of people. That's just become like the norm. And we have no ability on the loan side to make any exclusive agreement with a buyer. That's not even an option. I mean, you deal with mortgage compliance as well. So, maybe we'll be in sharing the same grief with buyer's agents to a degree, but that's just the nature of how we work. We know we're going to win some, going to lose some, but we can't tie a buyer into requiring them to use us for financing.
Right. Yeah, no, it's obvious. Again, it's different industry, different practices, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to turn a little bit, now we're kind of on that topic, to talk about the mortgage side, because there is a solution. So in the event that the buyer ends up being responsible for that brokerage commission, first of all, there's two ways we can structure it. And this may sound like the same, but they're a little bit different because the wording of the contract is actually quite important as far as how you do this. So one way is, let's say you agree to a price of $900,000 and you've got a $25,000 broker's commission. What you could do is, before that contract is signed, or you can do an amendment where you actually increase the price beyond the agreed price that would have had no commission, to build that commission into the price, and then either have the seller pay it directly, just that it's specified in the contract that the seller is responsible for it, or the other way is to treat it as a seller's concession toward closing costs. And the government types of loans, like the Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's, haven't really come out with any specific guidance on this, but I know internally that's something that we have vetted and feel very comfortable with. But the importance is to make sure that you talk to the lender that you're working with. Hopefully it's us, but I know other lenders are out there too, in terms of how to structure this properly and make sure that you're doing it in a way that's compliant for the loan that the buyer is getting. Going to be really critical, especially because there are maximum concessions you can get. So if you structure it as a seller's concession toward quote unquote closing costs, which would now theoretically include the buyer's agent commission, which will now need to be on a loan estimate as well. You have to be careful because the maximum concessions you can get is usually, depending on the program, 3 to 6%. 3 is probably more common than 6. So if you're planning on giving additional concessions toward the actual closing costs, not the buyer's agent commission, you might exceed those thresholds. So it's definitely something that we need to be mindful of. But in the event that the agents on this call or people that watch the recording later run into that issue where the buyer's agent fee is payable by the buyer in the end because they end up buying a listing that doesn't have a commission, there is a way that we can work with you to structure that and build it in, and hopefully, everything works out okay in the end and the buyers are, in good shape there. So there is a solution to that kind of worst case scenario for a buyer that we can definitely work with people on. So Neil, I want to turn to some questions that we got. There were several that we got in advance, so thank you for those who submitted those questions, and we have some additional questions coming through the Q&A, which I'll queue up to you because you're the expert. These are mostly questions for you, so I'll put you on the spot, like 20 questions here. So Jeff, who is an agent in New York City, is asking, as a result of the ruling, we are not required by company policy at many major firms to be part of are we not responsible to be part of Rebney anymore? I haven't been getting payment demand letters as I have in previous years. What does the future of Rebney look like with less members or income, and how do non-member listings get on CitySnap? So that's a lot of questions all in one. I'm not sure.
I don't see, number one, I think Rebney plays a very vital and important role. There's a, obviously, they have the RLS, which is where you list your properties and so on. You have an agreement, code of ethics, the way you cooperate with each other. So I'm not sure about the whole demand thing, and I just don't know. Nothing requires you to be a member of Rebney, nor does it require you to be a member of NAR or anything else. I think it's over 100 years old. It's been a successful organization where people have come to work together and cooperate. So I think that's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, understood. So maybe just be a billing issue. So
it could be a billing, exactly.
Who knows? Okay, we have a question from Jason, who's a financial advisor. Presumably, there's no way to claw back any commissions from past sales prior to the ruling being finalized. So I think the tone of that question is, if a deal happened last year, you can't go back and change that commission to collect on something that you couldn't have collected on previously, or vice versa.
So, well, I mean, admittedly, I'm not an expert in how they're structuring these lawsuits, but the lawsuits effectively, I suppose, are based on commissions paid. So if you're talking about clawbacks associated with the particular lawsuits, that however you want to phrase it, that's effectively what that's about. I'm not sure. I don't think a seller could turn around and say, without going to, oh, you need to reimburse me the money. I don't see that. So again, a lot of unknowns here, a lot of unknowns.
Right. Yeah, and you'd think once a transaction's closed, the seller basically agreed to pay that commission when they paid it at closing. So it seems like it would be unlikely that they would be able to go back on that after the fact, especially if the ruling wasn't in yet. Okay, we have a question from Vicky, who's also a real estate agent. What is your best suggestion to an owner as to why they should pay buyer's broker, and how would you frame that conversation?
Really, it's a good question, right? Because part of this whole theory is the idea that that the selling broker should not require a buyer's broker to be paid, right? So that's kind of what this is saying, that by requiring that seller to pay the buyer's broker, there is this concept of an antitrust environment. That being said, I think the way that the important way that you couch this is to say, look, you want to sell your property. What do you think is the best way to sell your property? Best way to sell your property is to get as many eyeballs on that property as possible, and to incentivize people to want to see that property. So how do you think that's going to occur? What do you think is in your best interest? What do you think is the best interest of the buyer as well? So I think if you phrase it from the idea of what's in your interest, what's in the buyer's interest. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you think about what the best way to drive as many people to your property, and these are the various ways that you could structure that. You make the decision, and I think that's the best way to do that.
For sure. And we do have a couple of hands raised. If possible, it would be better if you can put your question in the Q&A. If not, just put in the Q&A that you want me to call on you and unmute you, and we will definitely do so. We just want to make sure that that's not on by accident. But we'll go through a few other questions that came in ahead of time. Another Jeff, different Jeff, who is also an agent in New York City. Does Rebney encourage its members to do business in such a way that would avoid the potential liability that was judged in the Missouri case?
So to be clear, right, as I said before, Rebney never had this requirement of compensation. So they never had the issue that that NAR is facing. REBNY never required that as part of their procedures. So they're two different things. The changes that were made were about transparency, and they had been looking at this for quite some time. I think it's so, obviously with an eye to what's going on there. I think these changes as a whole are demonstrate what the concerns were. So it really does create this idea of decoupling commissions, which we really didn't have before, but now it's far more, it is more transparent.
Got it. Okay. Next question is from Teresa, also a real estate agent in New York City. When extending an exclusive listing that started in 2023, she would be giving the seller an option to give the buyer's broker a lesser commission, essentially writing up a new listing agreement once the old one expires.
Well, so first of all, I can't speak if Teresa is part of the REBNY environment, then the new rules took effect as of 2024. So her 2023 listing is not affected by this. So you do not need to change your listing. Then she said something at the end, well, if it expires and now a new listing is entered into as of 2024, then you would need these new requirements. But let's be clear, not all that different than the old requirements. All this is saying is that if you want to offer compensation to the buyer's broker, you'll just do that directly. So that's one piece, and then the seller will pay the buyer's broker directly. Those are the two kind of key things. Again, not all that different than what had always been done. If people think about it, they would go to the RLS, they would see that there was a buyer's brokerage commission offered. The only difference now is it's coming directly from the seller. Got it.
Okay. This is a question from Steve, who is, this is a loaded question, I'm sure. Hi, Steve. Steve is my boss and owner of NJ Lenders. He wants to know, do you believe loan officers will now be getting referrals from listing agents more than buyer's agents? I think that's an encouragement for me to start talking to more listing agents, but if you have any advice on that, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, look, how do I say, without being cute, like I talk to everyone, right? We do, that's what we do. We talk to everyone, we market. I never limit my marketing in one way or another. So I don't know, again, personally, and I really can only speak to the REBNY environment. By the way, the NAR environments, some are changing, some are kind of still sitting there because they're made. So I can only speak. I don't see all that much changing. They're, as you've suggested, Mark, they've opened up a conversation, they've added a discussion, right? A discussion piece. But in terms of how this is going to play out, I think that things are going to stay relatively the same. I think sellers are smart enough to say, wait a minute, like, I want to just sell my property, and this is, I think, the best way to do that. So, okay, let them come to that conclusion, and that's fine. So I don't think, back to Steve's question, I don't think things are going to change that much. Would I encourage you to talk to lots of real estate agents? I would.
I will. Well, we were approaching 150 on this call, so that's a good start. But yeah, Steve, I promise I'll keep working hard. Don't worry. Okay, a question from Jill, who's also a real estate agent in New York. Will there be an updated residential purchase contract template that includes who's responsible for the buyer and seller agent commissions?
It's a good question, Jill. I don't know in terms of whether it's Bloomberg or there's the New York State Bar Association, I think, puts out one. I think the answer is yes. Ultimately, those drafting committees will come together, and they probably will amend the residential contract, because the residential contract currently says that that the buyer and seller represent that they haven't dealt with any brokers other than, and the seller will pay the commission pursuant to a separate agreement. So now that very well that provision is going to potentially change. So it's a good question. I'm not aware that they've come out with it yet, but we as transactional attorneys are aware of that.
Yeah, and in non-attorney states like California, where we also do a lot of business, that's usually specified in a contract already. So I think one of the things that's interesting is New York is kind of its own animal. It's an attorney state. It just functions very differently than other parts of the country. But a lot of times this is sort of worked out and disclosed between agent comments, like in the MLS. It's already there for people to see. Buyer's agent gets paid whatever, 2.5%, 3%, whatever it is. So a lot of this isn't really changing much of anything, again, other than what you mentioned, where it sort of forces that initial conversation with between a buyer and a buyer's agent. But a lot of this is already kind of happening outside of New York. I heard a stat, and it's totally unconfirmed, so please nobody quote me on this, but when apparently there were some changes in the Seattle market in particular, where there started being more disclosures about buyers' commissions and things like that, and sellers were given the option to not necessarily quote unquote have to pay a buyer's broker, but still something like over 90% of the sellers still chose to pay the buyer's broker through the commissions. Because it's very short-sighted. If you're trying to save 1 or 2%, it's really not a lot, and you risk potentially a lot more of what you would lose by not encouraging agents to bring their buyers.
Right. If they don't encourage that, right, but the buyer comes and the buyer has less money in their pocket to pay, that's my struggle with this is, right, it's all, again, all the monies are fungible. You have a limited universe of monies, how they're going to be whacked up, and you're I think that the potential downsides, as I said, buyers being left out in the cold and not being represented at all, or shifting the way that they pay. But I'm not sure that it's going to change nearly as much as supposedly they think it's going to.
Yeah, and I think sellers also have to be mindful of how much of a burden buyers already have with closing costs. So New York, you've got the mortgage recording tax, potentially, if it's not a co-op, you've got mansion tax, you've got in LA now in the surrounding areas, there's a massive mansion tax for high-end properties. So if you're going to tack on a broker's agent commission, like at some point buyers will just say no. And especially right now with higher interest rates, you don't want to encourage buyers to have any additional reasons to not want to proceed. So it seems, at least in the current environment, like people may be, encouraged to continue business as usual, where the
again, it's a struggle that I feel like many of the people that are making the rules, they're not involved in the business. They don't understand what's going on. They don't live it day to day. That's always been a struggle that I have, and again, it is really just ultimately pure economics. People make a decision based on how they get to the finish line. So,
Yep. And we had another question that came into the Q&A from someone in California. It's an anonymous attendee, so I don't know what your name is, but great question. Like to know more about the impact on transactions, regular transactions versus high-end real estate, i.e. 5 million plus. And I think that is relevant to what we were just talking about with the mansion tax. My personal opinion, you should weigh in as well, is you got to be mindful of what that buyer's already having to pay. So if you've got a $5+ million listing and they're going to be paying, several percent in mansion tax, assuming that doesn't get voted down at some point, because I know there's a lot of resistance to it. You've got to be mindful of how much you're putting on the buyer, and at some point they're just going to say no. But I don't know if you have any additional insight, Neil.
I really don't. I'm not sure. Again, the money's the money, right? So like you said, Mark, the more the closing costs are really expensive. And so particularly in this environment, right, we've got low inventory, interest rates are up, particularly interest rates are up. Buyers aren't buying, they just can't afford to. So now you want to throw this into the mix. I think it's not going to create the level playing field I think that they think it is going to.
And I would say it's, you've got certain sellers who go for sale by owner because they want to save the commissions, those are still going to go for sale by owner because those people are probably the ones who are most short-sighted. But the
Right.
ones who are working with agents, a good listing agent should be able to explain clearly why it's important to have buyer's agents incentivized to come show their property.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll see, but thank you for that question. Another question, seems like 5% commission split between agents is pretty widely accepted. Do you see that balance shifting? In what direction and when?
So number one, we never talk about commissions. We never talk about numbers. Commissions are completely negotiable. You can set whatever you want to set. That's just the bottom line. That being said, the idea of, you know, buyers, brokers, and sellers brokers, working together for that collective commission seems to work pretty well. So I don't think that that's going to change all that much. And I think the parties are smart enough to know that.
Right. One of the concerns again that I've heard is that listing agents may be incentivized to grab a little bit larger share of that commission, the total commission that the seller might be willing to pay. But I guess that's
But they could have,
be case by
they could have
case.
done that anyway. The only
Right.
the only caveat I would say to that was that a good listing agreement should have provided that, meaning that the listing broker should be clear that what they're offering to a cooperating broker. It shouldn't be up to the listing broker to say, well, I'll offer this one X% and another one Y%. The listing agreement should have been very clear with the seller that, you know what, I'm going to keep more of a commission, and this is what we're going to share with the buyer's commission. Perfectly legal, no problem with that. That's always been the case.
Right. Okay. Next question, also from an anonymous attendee. How long do you think the appeals process will go on until this is settled? It's a tough question.
Years. It could be years. For any of you, I hope you're never involved in litigation, but litigation is horrible. And it just stretches out and stretches out. And it's not uncommon to have things going on 2-3 years. It's just not. Now, this is more high profile. Maybe somehow there's a push here. I don't know. I don't know. But just in general, I can share with you that litigation is it is time consuming, expensive, and there's certainly no guarantees. That's for sure.
Right. Okay, very important question from our friend Philip, who we both have known for a long time, and I know why this question is coming in. Big golf advocate. Neil, are you finally shooting in the 70s?
Absolutely not. I'm too busy to not playing nearly enough golf, but hopefully Phil is, because I believe he's in Arizona right now. He's probably playing golf right now.
Yep, exactly. Knowing our friend, I could pretty much guarantee that. I'm going to make it there someday, I promise. Another question from Kale here in LA. Do you think this will bring the cost down for housing since the buyers are incurring costs they previously did not?
So so it's possible that, look, if you're going to throw this on the buyers, right now, the buyers it's just going to be another closing cost. Bad, good, or otherwise. Like, we don't need to talk about it in that regard. Is this good, bad, or otherwise? If we just take the basic economic concept that if this is just another closing cost, then there's no question in my mind that the sellers are going to have to reduce their purchase price at some point, because the buyers have a limited capacity to purchase. So in short, could it bring down the market? Sure, I suppose you could make that argument. But the money's fungible, right? So I could also make the argument that it's 6 of 1, right? The seller is paying less, but they're getting less. So,
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, that was going to be the comment I was going to be making, is that sellers are always looking at what they're going to net. What are they going to walk away with? They don't care if
Right.
if it's a higher price and they pay more in commissions. They care about how much they're going to walk away with. So I think that can be negotiated, and especially if it can be built into the mortgage, that therein lies solves the problem. And that's, you got to assume right now, if in the past, before 2024, before this ruling, commissions were more or less standard, paid through the seller side, the that was already factored in.
Yeah, so Mark, as I'm thinking about it now, right? I mean, I suppose you could make the argument maybe they would come down, but in theory, then if the buyer's paying it, they're going to pay less to the seller, but the seller's paying less commission. So again, I go back to you have this fungible pool of money that's going to be whacked up. It's going to still be whacked up, and so that's why I think a lot of this is just perhaps just an enormous waste of time and resources and money at the end of the day.
Right. Okay, we have one last question before we wrap up. Why would Street Easy show a co-broke commission if that is to be negotiated with the seller directly and not the listing agent?
I don't really follow Street Easy. It's its own entity, so it's it's in business. It's a huge money making business, right? So I can't really speak to their to how they structure their offerings. I just don't know.
Right. And for those who are not from New York City, Street Easy is a company owned by Zillow that provides listing information for New York City listings. So, okay, well, Neil, I think we have run out of questions. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with everybody. Like I said, as soon as we knew we had to do this type of session, it was an immediate call to you. You're a great resource, and your knowledge of REBNY and just real estate in general is second to none. So thank you so much for sharing your insight with everybody today. And maybe we'll be doing a follow-up session as things unfold further and we get more information about how things are playing out. But I think the big takeaway is that things are going to be more or less the same, with one additional very important discussion happening between buyers and buyers brokers.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say it differently, Mark, if you don't mind. I think things are going to be the same, but with lots of different conversations, right? So the ultimate, how you can transact, probably going to stay similar, but you're going to have a lot more conversations, a lot more need and opportunity to talk about those things. And that's really what the focus should be, is really making sure you understand this. That I think is what's going to be really important.
Absolutely. And I think secondary to that is also working with a lender who will help you resolve some of these challenges that you may be having with a buyer. So if you are working with a buyer who's reluctant to sign that agreement, it might be a discussion they want to have with their lender to say, well, here's the workaround in the event that you run into this situation. Maybe that would put them at ease.
Absolutely. It's not only the mortgage person. We're all kind of in the same team, on the same. The attorneys are going to need to do a much better job explaining things. The everyone is going to need to do that. So you need to, the consumer's going to need to pick their team wisely.
Yeah, I would agree. And, the one other thing, side note, is that for people in New York City, I think it also lends to the fact that they should get an attorney involved sooner. A buyer's attorney should be hired earlier because they might have to answer questions about that buyer's agreement.
Sure. And we always talked about this well before this, is that buyers and sellers should get their team together immediately. The professionals know what they're doing and can definitely make a big difference.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Neil, thank you again so much for joining us on this episode of On the Mark. And we will be turning this into a podcast episode as well. So for those of you who attended live, thank you for attending. For those who are going to be checking out the recording afterwards, feel free to email us your questions. We will be happy to answer them. I'm going to put up our contact information here in case you guys have any questions. You can feel free to reach out, but we appreciate everybody joining today and look forward to future sessions and future discussions about this, Neil. So thank you again.
See you soon. Thanks again.
Take care.